On January 2nd, 1777, an American brigadier general rode away from the most important assignment of his life. Behind him stood roughly 1,000 soldiers positioned on the road between Princeton and Trenton. In front of them came a British and Hessian force several times their size, led by Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis. The Americans had one job: delay that army for as long as possible. Their commanding officer, Matthias Alexis Roche de Fermoy, was supposed to direct the defense. Instead, he returned toward Trenton drunk and left his men without their general as the enemy approached. It sounds like the beginning of a disaster. In a strange way, it became the beginning of a rescue. Fermoy's disappearance placed command in the hands of Colonel Edward Hand, an Irish physician, former British Army surgeon's mate, and veteran rifle officer. Hand did not have enough men to defeat Cornwallis. He did not need to. He needed to defeat the clock. To understand why those hours mattered, forget the familiar image of the American Revolution as an inevitable march toward independence. At the end of 1776, nothing felt inevitable. Washington's army had been driven from Long Island, forced out of New York, pushed across New Jersey, and pressed toward the Delaware River. Men were sick, exhausted, poorly supplied, and counting the days until their enlistments expired. The British occupied the strategic center of the war. Their regulars were disciplined. Their Hessian auxiliaries were experienced. Their commanders believed the rebellion was nearly finished. Washington had won a stunning victory at Trenton on December 26, but one successful surprise attack had not destroyed British power in New Jersey. It had done something more fragile. It had created a moment of hope. Now that hope had attracted a response, Cornwallis moved quickly to crush it. He assembled a force of about 8,000 men around Princeton for the operation. Not all of them would march all the way to Trenton. Detachments had to remain behind to protect positions and communications. But the column advancing south was still enormous compared with the force Washington sent to slow it. The British commander understood what was at stake. If he moved fast enough, he could pin Washington against the Delaware River. The American army would have a creek at its front, a river near its rear, and a superior enemy pressing down from the north. There would be no easy road out. A victory at Trenton could become a trap at Trenton. Washington's main force was taking position south of the town behind Assunpink Creek. He had roughly 7,000 men available in the area, a mixture of Continental troops and militia whose quality, equipment, and endurance varied greatly. The creek offered a defensive line, but a defensive line is only as strong as the time available to prepare it. Artillery had to be placed. Infantry had to be assigned to the bridge and the fords. Units still moving toward Trenton had to arrive. Men needed to understand where they were expected to stand when the British appeared. Every hour Cornwallis spent on the road was an hour Washington could use to turn a dangerous creek bank into a battlefield. That was the purpose of the advanced force. Washington placed it along the main Princeton-Trenton road because Cornwallis could not simply wish the road away. An 18th century army was not a cloud of men drifting freely over the countryside. It moved with artillery, ammunition, horses, wagons, officers, formations, and orders. Roads organized that movement. Bridges and stream crossings narrowed it. Woods, ravines, fences, and bends in the route could hide defenders and force an advancing column to unfold into fighting lines. Hand understood this kind of warfare. He had commanded Pennsylvania riflemen and had already gained experience delaying British troops during the 1776 campaign. He knew that a smaller force could not remain fixed against a larger one. It had to strike, disappear, reform, and strike again. Hand was an unlikely figure to hold the survival of the revolution in his hands. Born in Ireland in 1744, he studied medicine and entered British service as a surgeon's mate in the 18th Royal Irish Regiment of Foot. He crossed the Atlantic as part of the imperial military system the revolution would later resist. He eventually left that service, settled in Pennsylvania, and practiced medicine. When rebellion came, the former British medical officer joined the Continental cause. He entered a force that valued the skills of riflemen, but often struggled to integrate those skills into a larger army. Riflemen could shoot accurately at longer ranges than ordinary smoothbore infantry, but they could not win a conventional battle alone. Their weapons loaded more slowly. They lacked bayonets. If trapped in the open by formed infantry or cavalry, they could be destroyed. Their strength was in cover, distance, movement, and disruption. On the morning of January 2nd, Hans suddenly inherited responsibility for more than his own regiment. Fermoy's departure left him as the senior officer present. Around him were riflemen, Continental infantry, German troops serving the American cause, Virginia units, and field artillery. These men were not a single light infantry machine trained for years to execute one doctrine. Hand had to make them function together immediately. There was no time for a council, no time for a rehearsal, and no possibility of asking Washington for a replacement commander before Cornwallis arrived. The enemy's advance made the decision for him. The British column was designed to break resistance, not negotiate with it. Cornwallis placed light infantry and Hessian Jaegers forward. These were the troops best suited to screen the march, find the enemy, and drive away skirmishers. Behind them came formed battalions and artillery. The standard British answer to a small blocking force was simple: make contact, deploy enough troops to overwhelm it, push it aside, reform the column, and continue. Against frightened militia or an inexperienced commander, that procedure could become a rout. Against Edward Hand, every part of the procedure became a tax paid in minutes. Hand did not attempt to defend every yard of road. That would have spread his men too thin and allowed the British to crush isolated groups. He treated the route as a sequence of temporary positions: a creek line, a patch of woods, a fence, a ravine, a house, a bend. At each position, some of his men would open fire from cover. The British vanguard would halt. Officers would try to determine whether they faced a handful of marksmen or the edge of Washington's main army. More troops would deploy. Guns might be brought forward. The attackers would begin to close. Before the British could fix them in place, the Americans would withdraw toward the next obstacle. This was not retreat as collapse. It was retreat as a weapon. The distance yielded was the price of time purchased. Hand's men were giving Cornwallis the road one section at a time, but they were refusing to give him the day. The first shots announced that the march to Trenton would not be a parade. Rifle fire came from concealed positions. British and Hessian skirmishers moved forward to answer it. The American line pulled back before the heavier formation could trap it. Then the same pattern appeared again. The British advanced, found another resistance point, deployed, and discovered that the defenders had already begun moving. Each American position was too small to justify a full battle, yet too dangerous to ignore. Cornwallis could not safely leave armed men on his flanks and behind his column. He had to clear the road. At 8 Mile Run, then 5 Mile Run, and later Shabakunk Creek, the landscape became part of Hand's command. Streams slowed feet and wheels. Banks created cover. Trees concealed the actual number of defenders. Riflemen could aim at exposed figures, fire, and fall back through ground they had already studied. Artillery added weight to the resistance, suggesting that this might be more than a screen. The British could see smoke and movement, hear shots from different points, and feel the march stopping again. What they could not easily see was the central fact of the engagement. Hand's force did not need to hold any one position forever. It only had to make every position look expensive for long enough. At Shabakunk Creek, Hand chose stronger ground and made a more determined stand. Riflemen occupied cover among the trees. Infantry supported them. The volume of fire and the stubbornness of the defense convinced the British that they might have reached a much larger body of Washington's army. Cornwallis's troops deployed into battle formation and brought artillery forward. This was exactly what Hand needed. An army moving in column could cover distance. An army deploying for battle had to stop, spread, align, receive orders, and prepare its guns. Hand had transformed uncertainty into delay. The British outnumbered the Americans at that point by roughly 6-1. Hand could not remain indefinitely. Once Cornwallis had enough men in position and began applying the weight of his force, the American defense would be forced back. But dislodging it took time. The stand at Shabakunk Creek consumed about 2 hours. 2 hours for a position that was never intended to be the final line. 2 hours during which Washington's soldiers at Assunpink Creek strengthened their works, arranged their artillery, and watched additional troops enter Trenton. 2 hours during which the winter sun continued moving toward the horizon. That is the paradox at the center of this battle. Vermoy's drunken abandonment was not an act of courage. It was not a hidden plan. It was a failure of command at the exact moment command mattered most. But history does not always reward intention. Sometimes the consequence of a disgraceful act depends on who steps into the empty space it creates. Had Vermoy remained and handled the delaying force badly, Cornwallis might have reached Trenton earlier. Had the abandoned troops panicked, the road might have opened immediately. Instead, Vermoy vanished, and Edward Hand took control. The wrong man left, the right man remained. If you value military history that explains not only what happened, but why each decision mattered, subscribe now. Because the next part of this story is where a delaying action becomes the hinge of a revolution. By mid-afternoon, Cornwallis was still not where he needed to be. His army had advanced only a few miles, yet it had repeatedly changed from a marching column into a fighting formation. Officers had ridden forward and back. Light troops had searched woods and creek banks. Artillery had been unlimbered, aimed, fired, and moved again. Every transition demanded effort. Every transition created disorder that had to be corrected before the march continued. Hand's force was being pressed toward Trenton, but it remained a force, not a mob. Around 3 o'clock, with daylight running out, the Americans fell back towards Stockton Hollow, a ravine near the outskirts of town. The tactical problem was becoming more dangerous. Earlier positions had offered room to retreat. Now the space between Hand and Washington's main line was shrinking. The full British force was coming into action. A delaying force survives by refusing decisive combat. But there comes a point when the enemy is close enough, broad enough, and fast enough to threaten the withdrawal itself. If Hand stayed too long, his men could be cut off before reaching the bridge. If he left too early, Cornwallis would gain the remaining daylight and strike Washington before darkness. Washington rode forward and demanded the most stubborn stand the troops could make. The order reflected the brutal arithmetic of the situation. The advance force was in danger, but the army behind it needed minutes more than it needed safety for every unit. Hand had to continue resisting while preserving enough control to escape through a town that was about to fill with British and Hessian troops. The fighting changed as the road entered the outskirts of Trenton. Woods and streams gave way to buildings, lanes, fences, and intersections. Hand's men fired from houses and other cover. The British pressed closer. Formations became harder to maintain. Smoke remained between structures. Orders that were clear on open ground became confused in narrow spaces. Some Americans began moving quickly toward the Assunpink Bridge. Others headed for fords. Washington sent Colonel Daniel Hitchcock's brigade forward to support the withdrawal and prevent Hand's screen from being swallowed by the British advance. This was the most delicate part of the entire operation. A controlled retreat through open country can be organized by successive lines. A retreat through a town, with the enemy entering behind it, can become panic in seconds. Men see comrades running and assume the line has broken. Wagons block streets. Officers lose sight of units. A bridge ahead becomes a magnet. The pressure of hundreds of men trying to cross can destroy order before the enemy even reaches them. Washington understood the danger. He positioned himself near the southern approach to the bridge, visible to men falling back through Trenton. His presence told them that the army had not collapsed and that the bridge was not merely an escape route. It was the entrance to the final defensive line. Hand's delaying force had spent the day trading ground for time. Now the exchange had to end. South of Assunpink Creek, Washington intended to hold. The terrain gave him several possible crossing points to defend. The stone bridge from Trenton was the most obvious and direct. Artillery covered it. Infantry occupied positions behind the creek. Upstream were fords, including a more usable crossing near Phillips Mill, where Washington placed a substantial part of his infantry. Another upstream crossing was made difficult by the fast water and received only a smaller guard. Downstream lay an easier crossing, but it was farther from the direction of the British approach. Cornwallis had choices, but darkness was removing them. That was the strategic value of every shot Hand's men had fired since morning. Had Cornwallis arrived hours earlier, he could have examined the creek line, moved troops toward the fords, coordinated artillery, and launched a broader assault while the sun remained high. Arriving near nightfall, he faced pressure to attack immediately. The bridge lay directly ahead. Washington's army was visible across the creek. The British had spent the day forcing their way toward a final confrontation. To halt now would mean giving the Americans a night to improve their position or escape. Around 5 o'clock, British and Hessian troops attacked. The bridge compressed the assault. Men who had marched and fought for hours now had to move into a narrow approach covered by American muskets and artillery. The defenders did not need to search for targets. The crossing placed the attackers in front of them. Fire struck the head of the column. Wounded men obstructed those behind. Momentum stalled. The attackers came again. The professional quality of the British and Hessian troops mattered. These were not men who dissolved after one failed rush. Officers reformed them. Units moved back into position. Another effort drove toward the bridge, and another storm of American fire met it. The creek, which looked small on a map, became a barrier because Washington had men, guns, and time on the southern bank. A third attack followed. Again, it failed. 3 assaults had been beaten back. The light was gone. The British held Trenton, but Washington still held the line south of the creek. Cornwallis had reached the battlefield he wanted, yet he had reached it too late to use the full strength of his army. The numerical payoff was not a spectacular body count. The sources do not agree closely enough on total casualties to make one exact figure the center of the story. The more important numbers are clearer. Roughly 1,000 men in the advance force had delayed a British and Hessian column many times larger for most of the day. At Shabakunk Creek, they had resisted while outnumbered about 6 to 1 and forced the enemy to spend approximately 2 hours taking a temporary position. At Assunpink Creek, Washington's army then repelled 3 attacks over the bridge. Hand had not destroyed Cornwallis's force. He had destroyed Cornwallis's schedule. That evening, the British commander still believed the strategic situation favored him. Washington's army appeared trapped. The Delaware River limited movement to the west. The Assunpink divided the armies. British troops had identified fords that could be attacked the next morning. With daylight, Cornwallis could send forces across those points, turn the American position, and press Washington back toward the river. The Americans had survived January 2nd, but survival for one night was not victory. Washington gathered his senior officers and considered the problem. Remaining behind the creek meant facing a larger, professional force when it could use daylight and maneuver. Retreating across the Delaware would surrender the initiative gained at Trenton and might be difficult under pressure. A direct night attack on Cornwallis would throw tired troops against a prepared enemy. The apparent choices all led backward. Then Washington changed the map. Instead of retreating west or waiting south of Trenton, he would move northeast around Cornwallis and strike Princeton. The British had concentrated strength in front of him. That concentration meant fewer troops remained behind them. The road Cornwallis had used to approach Trenton had become a line leading back to a vulnerable rear area. If Washington could leave his camp without alerting the British, march around their flank, and reach Princeton, he could turn entrapment into offensive opportunity. The plan depended on deception, silence, and the physical condition of the roads. Campfires were kept burning along the American line. A small force remained to maintain the appearance of occupation, make noise, and fire occasional artillery rounds. To British observers across the creek, the army still seemed present. Behind that screen, Continental soldiers began moving away. Imagine the risk. Thousands of men had to leave positions close to the enemy without creating the sound and confusion that usually followed an army on the march. Artillery wheels, horses, muskets, equipment, and human voices could carry in the cold night. One alarm from a British picket might bring Cornwallis forward before Washington cleared the area. The escape route was not a broad road leading safely away. It was a movement around the enemy toward another fight. Yet the same day that had exhausted the Americans had also exhausted the British. Cornwallis's men had marched, deployed, skirmished, advanced, and attacked. Darkness made reconnaissance difficult. The fires suggested that Washington was still where Cornwallis expected him to be. Confidence became part of the deception. The British commander believed he had time because he believed the Americans had nowhere useful to go. Hand's delay had made this possible in two separate ways. First, it had allowed Washington to survive behind Assunpink Creek. Without the hours purchased on the road, the main army might have been attacked before its line was ready. Second, the delay pushed the final engagement into darkness. Darkness stopped Cornwallis from exploiting the fords immediately, and darkness gave Washington the cover to disappear. The same lost daylight that protected the bridge now protected the march to Princeton. Before dawn on January 3rd, Cornwallis's problem revealed itself. The American camp was empty. The enemy he expected to finish was no longer in front of him. Cannon fire sounded from the direction of Princeton, behind and to the left of the British position. Washington had not simply escaped. He had moved onto Cornwallis's line of communications and attacked the troops left in the rear. At Princeton, the Americans encountered British forces under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Moorhood. The battle did not unfold as a simple ambush or an effortless continuation of Trenton. American troops met fierce resistance. Brigadier General Hugh Mercer was mortally wounded after close fighting. Parts of the American force recoiled. Washington personally rallied men and drove the attack forward. The British were eventually forced from the field, and the Americans captured roughly 300 prisoners. Cornwallis had to turn back toward the sound of battle. The commander who had spent January 2nd pushing Washington south now found himself racing north after an army that had passed around him in the night. He was again reacting. Princeton was not merely another local success. It completed the reversal begun at Trenton. In less than 2 weeks, Washington's army had crossed an icy river, surprised the Hessian garrison at Trenton, survived Cornwallis's counterattack at Assunpink Creek, escaped an apparent trap, and defeated British troops at Princeton. These actions became known together as the 10 Crucial Days. Their importance was psychological as well as tactical. The revolution needed proof that British power could be resisted by more than speeches and declarations. It needed soldiers to believe that remaining in the army was not a decision to join a doomed cause. It needed civilians to see that the British occupation of New Jersey was not permanent. It needed foreign observers to notice that the rebellion still possessed an army capable of planning, maneuvering, and winning. Washington is rightly central to that story. He chose to cross the Delaware. He returned to New Jersey. He organized the defense along Assunpink Creek. He approved the night march and struck Princeton. But great commanders survive through the actions of people below them, often at moments the commander cannot directly control. Washington could order a delaying force onto the Princeton Road. He could not personally occupy every creek bank, judge every withdrawal, or keep every unit from breaking. On January 2nd, those responsibilities belonged to Edward Hand because the appointed general abandoned them. This is why the phrase, "a drunk general saved the revolution," is both true and false. For Moy did not save it through skill. He did not recognize the decisive ground, direct the riflemen, coordinate the withdrawals, or hold the bridge. His role was accidental and shameful. He removed himself from command, but by doing so, he created the vacancy Edward Hand filled. The act that should have shattered the American screen instead placed it under the officer best prepared to use terrain, uncertainty, and controlled retreat against a stronger army. Military history often celebrates destruction because destruction is easy to measure. Guns captured, battalions broken, prisoners taken, ground seized. Hand's achievement was harder to see. He preserved rather than destroyed. He produced absence, the attack that did not arrive in time. The flank maneuver Cornwallis could not launch before dark. the collapse that never happened in Trenton, and the American army that was no longer there when morning came. His weapon was not superior firepower, it was sequence. First, make the enemy halt, then make him deploy. Withdraw before he can close, force him to reform, repeat at the next obstacle. Use a stream as a wall for 20 minutes, a wood line as a curtain, a ravine as a break, and a town as a maze. Never confuse the temporary position with the mission. The mission was not 8 Mile Run. It was not 5 Mile Run. It was not Shabakunk Creek or Stockton Hollow. The mission was the setting sun. Hand's conduct also reveals the discipline hidden inside a successful retreat. Retreat is one of the most difficult military actions because soldiers naturally interpret backward movement as defeat. The enemy gains confidence. Units become mixed. Wounded men slow the column. Communication stretches. Every new position must be occupied by men who know they will soon abandon it. They must fire with enough force to convince the enemy to deploy, but they must not become so committed that they cannot escape. A commander must judge distance, time, morale, terrain, and enemy speed again and again. One error can convert elastic resistance into encirclement. Hand made those judgments under pressure while commanding troops he had not expected to lead that morning. His medical background did not make him a battlefield genius by itself, but it adds another layer to the man. He had crossed the Atlantic inside the British military establishment. He understood regular soldiers, the machinery of an imperial army, and the demands of disciplined service. Now he used that experience against the force from which he had come. He knew that British professionalism was powerful, but he also understood that professionalism operated through procedures. A trained army responded to threats by deploying correctly. Hand weaponized that correctness. Each time the British treated his small force as a serious tactical problem, they lost more of the one resource they could not replace that day. Cornwallis did not fail because he lacked courage or competent troops. His army pushed Hand back. It reached Trenton. It attacked the bridge. In conventional terms, the British won nearly every piece of ground between Princeton and Assunpink Creek. But the ground was not the decisive objective. Time was. Cornwallis took the road and lost the day. Hand surrendered miles and protected the revolution. The wider lesson is not that command failures are secretly beneficial, most are simply disastrous. Nor is it that drunkenness produced victory. The lesson is that organizations survive failures at the top when capable people below are prepared to assume responsibility without waiting for perfect instructions. Vermoy's disappearance created chaos. Hand converted chaos into command. Washington's plan provided the purpose. The soldiers provided the endurance. Terrain provided opportunities. Darkness provided the final shield. None of those elements alone would have been enough. Stand today along the route between Princeton and Trenton, and the distances can seem small. The creeks are not great rivers. The woods and ravines do not announce themselves as places where a nation's future turned. Assunpink Creek itself can appear too modest to have stopped an army. But battlefields are not defined by how dramatic they look in peace. They are defined by the pressure placed upon them in war. On January 2nd, 1777, every crossing narrowed choice. Every bend concealed danger. Every mile consumed light. A landscape of ordinary obstacles became a machine for manufacturing delay because Edward Hand understood how to use it. By the time Cornwallis saw Washington's defenses across the creek, the most important part of the battle had already occurred behind him. It had occurred in repeated halts along the road, in uncertain reports from the vanguard, in guns dragged forward against positions that vanished, and in American soldiers who withdrew without dissolving. The 3 failed attacks at the bridge were the visible climax. The invisible foundation was the day Hand had taken away from the British. And that is how a drunk general saved the revolution at its darkest hour. Not by leading, by leaving. Not through brilliance, through the accident of making room for it. Matthias de Vermoy rode back toward Trenton and disappeared from the command that history had assigned him. Edward Hand stepped forward, looked at a superior army, and understood that he did not have to defeat it. He only had to keep it busy until the sun went down. The sun went down, the bridge held, the campfires burned, Washington vanished into the night, and by the time Cornwallis understood what had happened, the revolution was already fighting behind him. If this breakdown changed the way you see Trenton, subscribe for more stories where terrain, timing, and one overlooked officer decide the fate of entire campaigns. Then tell me in the comments, was Edward Hand's delaying action the true masterpiece of the 10 Crucial Days? Or does Washington's Night March still deserve that title?